history can really throw some curveballs, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, take 1940. Germany, with a seriously outmatched navy, managed to invade Norway in under 2 months.
Yeah.
And the kicker, they did it right under the nose of the Royal Navy, Britain's supposed naval superpower.
Yeah, you think about the difference in naval strength. It is kind of mind-boggling how they pulled it off.
Totally. It's almost like a historical glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're diving deep into today. The German invasion of Norway in April 1940 is codenamed Unternehmen Weserübung, which translates to Operation Weser Exercise.
Weser exercise.
Right. We're basing our deep dive today on this really fascinating thesis. It uses this historical event, the invasion, to analyze, the strategies and lessons that can be applied to modern forcible entry operations.
Interesting.
So, for anyone who isn't super familiar with forcible entry as a military term, think of it this way. It's basically sending in troops, weapons, and all the support they need into a hostile area. And the goal is to overwhelm the enemy's ability to react. This could be done by land, sea, or air, or a combination of all three.
Right.
And get this. The thesis really emphasizes a few key factors that made Germany so successful in this whole operation. Surprise and speed, duh, but also a really well-played psychological campaign.
Okay.
And they had this impressive combined operations structure under a single command, which I guess is easier said than done.
Yeah, especially back then.
So our mission today is to figure out just how Germany managed to pull this off. It really seemed impossible at the time, right?
All
We're going to break down the conditions they set up to ensure their success, and honestly, there are some pretty shocking revelations when you look at the details.
You're intrigued already.
Me too.
Yeah.
Okay, so where should we even start with this? How did this even happen?
Well, to understand Germany's success, we really have to grasp the broader context of what was happening in the world at that time.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So, picture this. It's 1939. Poland has just fallen. Germany's shifting its focus to the Western Front. Right. And Hitler, he's getting increasingly nervous about the Allies, especially Britain, potentially occupying Norway. He saw this as a huge threat to Germany's northern flank.
Yeah, like a back door being left wide open.
Exactly. And it wasn't just some paranoid fantasy either. Norway, along with Sweden and Finland, had declared neutrality at the start of World War II.
Right.
But there were definitely things happening that could have pulled the Allies into the region.
So this neutrality was kind of shaky.
Exactly. Then you have the Russo-Finnish War kicking off at the end of 1939. This really put Scandinavia on the Allies' radar. Britain specifically saw a chance to support Finland, maybe even send troops through Norway and Sweden.
A strategic move with big implications.
Huge implications. And not just for positioning. This move directly threatened Germany's supply of Swedish iron ore, which was crucial for their weapons manufacturing.
Right, the lifeblood of their war machine.
Exactly. Almost half of the 9 million tons of iron ore Germany needed every year came through Narvik, a Norwegian port that stayed ice-free all year round.
Ah, so that's why Narvik was so important.
Exactly. Swedish ports froze over in the winter, so they couldn't handle all of Germany's needs. So Norway's neutrality basically gave Germany a back door to keep getting that essential iron ore.
A loophole in the British blockade.
Exactly. Now, at first, Germany was a bit hesitant to commit a bunch of resources to counter a potential Allied move, especially as long as Norway stayed neutral.
Right. Why spend the resources if it's working out for you, right?
Right. But they weren't naive. They started some preliminary planning just in case things went south.
Smart move.
Then, boom, the Altmark incident happened in February 1940. This changed everything. It really was a turning point for everyone involved.
Yeah, the Altmark incident. What happened there again? Remind me.
Okay, so a British patrol plane spots this German tanker, the Altmark, hanging out in Norwegian waters. This tanker was carrying British sailors who'd been captured by the Graf Spee.
Oh, right. The Graf Spee. The infamous pocket battleship.
Yeah, exactly. So the Altmark, it's trying to hide out in a Norwegian fjord, and Norway's like, nope, no prisoners here, move along.
I bet the British weren't buying that.
Not a chance. They demanded to search the Altmark themselves, but Norway said, no way, you're violating our neutrality.
A tense standoff.
Totally. So what do the British do? A British destroyer rams its way past the Norwegian escorts, boards the Altmark, and after a pretty big brawl with the German crew, frees about 300 British prisoners.
Oh, that's a bold move. Talk about escalating the situation.
It was a huge deal, a direct violation of Norway's neutrality by the British.
So the British basically said, neutrality be damned, we're getting our guys back. What did Germany and the Allies make of this whole thing?
Well, you gotta understand, this incident basically threw a wrench into everyone's plans. Both Hitler and the British realized that Norway's neutrality was hanging by a thread.
Right, all bets are off now.
Exactly. For Hitler, this was a wake-up call. He had to secure Norway, protect his northern flank, and make sure that iron ore kept flowing.
Can't let that supply line get cut.
Exactly. And for the British, this incident gave them the excuse they needed to intervene. They sped up their plans to lay mines in Norwegian waters, which, was also a violation of Norway's neutrality.
So both sides are basically planning to ignore Norway's neutrality, but Germany just happens to be quicker on the draw.
Pretty much. They were faster, more organized, and more decisive, leaving both the Norwegians and the Allies scrambling to react. But to really grasp how this all played out, we need to consider the playing field, so to speak.
Yeah.
Norway's geography was a huge factor in this whole invasion.
Okay, so Norway, geographically speaking, what are we dealing with?
Well, Norway's got this crazy long coastline, all chopped up with fjords, and inland. Mountains everywhere. Moving troops around on the ground is a nightmare.
And I'm guessing the infrastructure wasn't exactly top-notch back then either.
Not really. The road network was pretty basic, mostly just connecting the north and south and the cities along the coast. There were a couple of key airfields, Sola near Stavanger and Fornebu near Oslo. But they weren't exactly equipped to handle a ton of planes without some serious upgrades.
Right. Makes sense.
The rail network was decent, though. It connected major cities and even went into Sweden.
Okay, so roads, not so much. Airfields, kind of limited. But rail, not bad.
Right. And we can't forget about the timing. The invasion kicked off in April, right when winter was ending.
So spring was coming, the days were getting longer. How did that play into things?
It was a mixed bag. On one hand, the shorter nights made it harder to sneak those big warships in.
Right, less cover of darkness.
Exactly. But on the other hand, it was a big advantage for the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe.
Longer days mean more time to fly and bomb things.
Exactly. Plus, Germany was also planning to take Denmark at the same time, giving them access to all those great Danish airfields.
Smart move. So we've got Germany worried about the iron ore, feeling threatened by the Allies, and facing Norway's tricky geography. What were they hoping to achieve with this invasion? What was the big plan?
Their goals were pretty complex, actually. First off, they absolutely had to stop Britain from getting a foothold in Norway.
A defensive move.
Right. But they also wanted to ensure that Swedish iron ore kept coming in, no interruptions.
Vital for their war effort.
Exactly. Then there was the offensive part. They wanted to set up naval and air bases in Norway to project power against Britain.
Punch back across the North Sea.
Right. And let's not forget the psychological aspect. A successful invasion right under the Royal Navy's nose would be a huge blow to Allied morale.
Yeah, a real power move. So Hitler was very specific in his instructions to General Falkenhorst, who was leading the ground invasion. What was he told to do specifically?
Oh, Hitler was very clear. Falkenhorst had three main tasks. Stop any British attempts to get into Scandinavia or the Baltic, make sure the Swedish iron ore supply was completely secure, and establish a much wider front for the German Navy and Air Force to operate against Britain.
A blend of defensive and offensive objectives then. And in terms of the immediate military goal?
The goal was simple. Defeat the Norwegian military, and defeat them fast. They had two options. Either pull off a lightning-fast occupation, hoping the Norwegians wouldn't resist much, or just completely overwhelm them with superior firepower.
A blitzkrieg approach.
Exactly. And to do this, they needed to secure key points fast. Major cities, mobilization centers, communication lines, and coastal defenses. Basically, paralyze Norway before it could even get its act together.
A strategic knockout punch. Okay, let's talk about who was bringing what to this fight. Starting with Germany, what were their forces like?
Okay, so on the ground, they had 6 divisions.
6 divisions. How big is a division, roughly?
About 10,000 to 20,000 men, depending on the type.
Okay, so a sizable force.
Yeah, but here's the catch. Most of these divisions were pretty green, newly formed. The only one with real combat experience was the 3rd Mountain Division.
Ah, the mountain troops. Specially trained for tough terrain.
Exactly. Then, for air support, they had Flagger Corps X, their 10th Air Corps.
Flagger Corps X.
Yeah, and these guys specialized in attacking ships.
Okay. Sounds like a formidable air force.
They were good. But the German Navy, well, that was their weak spot. They were seriously outgunned by the Royal Navy. That was their biggest challenge.
The underdog in the naval arena. Okay, so when did Germany start seriously planning this invasion?
Well, they started thinking about it back in November 1939 under the name Study Nord. They were considering all sorts of reconnaissance, using military attachés, spies, even people connected to Vidkun Quisling.
Quisling, the Norwegian politician who collaborated with the Nazis.
Yeah, that's him. And they were also doing air reconnaissance. They identified 6 main landing areas, stretching all the way from Oslo in the south to Narvik in the north.
Okay, so a multi-pronged assault covering a huge area.
Right. And they initially wanted to split the attack force, half by air and half by sea, with lots of Luftwaffe support. Their goal was to hit those main landing zones, where the Norwegians kept their mobilization centers, and basically prevent the Norwegian army from forming up properly.
A clever strategy. Hit them before they can even organize.
Right. They even planned to use paratroopers to capture Sola and Fornebu, those key airfields we talked about.
Audacious. But the logistics of this whole thing must have been a nightmare. How did they plan to move all that equipment and those troops?
Well, they got creative. They used disguised cargo ships to carry the heavy stuff.
Yeah.
These ships would just blend in with regular traffic until the day of the invasion.
Sneaky.
Yeah, and for the initial assault troops, they were going in light and fast, mostly on warships. This allowed them to hit multiple spots at the same time, under cover of darkness.
So a synchronized surprise attack.
Exactly. They also leaned on Denmark to get access to their airfields, which were vital for protecting their supply lines.
Using Denmark as a forward base.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And then, of course, the Altmark incident happens, and Hitler brings in General Falkenhorst. How did the plans change under his leadership?
Well, after the Altmark incident, Hitler gave Falkenhorst and his XXI Corps full control of the operation.
Okay.
Falkenhorst decided to add Denmark to the plan. No more messing around. They were taking Denmark outright.
So secure Denmark first, then use it as a springboard for Norway.
Exactly. He also tweaked the organization of the invasion force and made sure it could be launched independently shortly before their planned invasion of France and the Low Countries. And then finally, Hitler set the date. Weser Day, April 9th, 1940.
D-Day for Norway. Okay, so that's the German side.
Yeah.
What about the Norwegians? What were their defenses like?
Well, unfortunately, the Norwegians weren't exactly in peak fighting shape.
Oh.
Yeah, they'd been dealing with budget cuts for years, so their military was kind of neglected. Their army, which was their biggest branch, was mostly made up of reservists.
Reservists?
Yeah, like civilians who'd get called up in an emergency. The problem was they hadn't had much training.
Not ideal.
Not at all. They were fit enough, but they weren't ready for a full-scale invasion, and most of their equipment was stored in the big cities, which, as we know, were the main targets.
Right, so they'd have to mobilize and get equipped before they could even fight back.
Exactly. When the invasion hit, they only had about 13,900 active soldiers, not nearly enough to defend that long coastline.
Yeah, that's not a great starting point. What about their navy? Norway's got a huge coastline, so you'd think they'd have a decent navy, right?
Well, they did have a navy, but it was mostly outdated. They had a bunch of ships, but only a few were built after World War I.
So mostly old, slow ships.
Yeah, not exactly the kind of firepower you want when you're facing a modern navy. Their coastal forts were undermanned, and they had to get government permission to lay mines, which slowed things down.
Bureaucracy in the face of an invasion, not a good mix.
Nope. And their air force was even worse. They had about 115 planes, but they were all outdated.
So basically they were going up against the Luftwaffe with biplanes.
Pretty much. But they weren't totally naive. They did have some plans.
Okay, so what were their main concerns? What were they preparing for?
They had 2 main worries. First, they were afraid the Russians might attack Narvik, maybe even team up with Sweden.
Right, because of the whole Russo-Finnish war thing.
Exactly. So they sent a brigade up north to keep an eye on things.
Okay, so a precautionary measure up north.
Right. And their second concern was defending their main ports from invasion.
Makes sense. Protect those vital harbors.
They had a battalion in each major port training for just that scenario, and their coastal forts were under orders to fire on any ship that violated their neutrality.
Except for British ships, right?
Yeah, they had this idea that Britain would come to their rescue if things got really bad.
A misplaced faith in their allies, it seems.
Yeah, they were hoping for the best, but not really preparing for the worst.
So that brings us to the Allies, Britain and France. What were they hoping to achieve in Scandinavia?
Their goals were a bit all over the place, but the main idea was to hit Germany indirectly. attack them on the edges of Europe instead of head-on.
A peripheral strategy.
Exactly. They had all these grand plans, bombing Russian oil fields, mining the Rhine, intervening in Finland. The Norway and Sweden thing was just another part of that.
Okay. So what were their specific goals for Norway and Sweden?
Well, they wanted to disrupt Germany's iron ore supply from Sweden, maybe even outflank them from the north. They also hoped to stir up anti-German sentiment in those countries, and if Germany made a move, use it as a chance to tighten their blockade.
Ambitious. What kind of troops did they have available for this whole Scandinavian adventure?
They had about 14,000 soldiers ready to go, mostly infantry, 8 battalions from Britain and 6 from France.
Okay. A decent-sized force. But were they prepared for what they'd face in Norway?
Not really. They were equipped and trained to land in friendly ports, not to fight their way through mountains and fjords.
So a lack of specialized training and equipment.
Exactly. They didn't have enough artillery, tanks, or even trucks to move around quickly, and their air support was practically non-existent.
Not exactly a recipe for success.
Nope. And to make matters worse, they really underestimated the Germans, especially the British. They were so confident in their navy that they didn't think the Germans would even try a seaborne invasion.
Overconfidence can be deadly.
It sure can. They were so focused on controlling the sea that they didn't have enough patrols or reconnaissance off the Norwegian coast. A huge blunder.
So they weren't expecting a surprise attack, basically.
Exactly. And their air cover was another major problem. British planes had to fly all the way from the UK, which stretched their range to the limit. They couldn't provide much support to their troops on the ground.
So no air superiority.
Nope. And the few carrier-based planes they had were old and outmatched. So basically, the Allies were going into this with a bad plan, not enough equipment, and no air support.
Not a winning combination. So what was their actual plan? How did they think they were going to pull this off?
Their main plan was called Operation Wilfred, and it involved laying mines in Norwegian waters. They figured they could disrupt the German iron ore shipments or force them out into the open where the Royal Navy could pick them off.
A risky move. Violating Norway's neutrality like that.
It was. And their ground plan, called R4, involved sending troops to occupy Narvik, Trondheim, and Bergen if the Germans made a move.
So a reactive strategy.
Pretty much. But here's the kicker. They only started laying mines one day before the German invasion began.
Talk about cutting it close.
It was, and it highlights a crucial point. Both sides were willing to ignore Norway's neutrality, but the Germans were just way more decisive and effective in their actions.
So a case of the early bird gets the worm, or in this case, the country.
Exactly. The Germans planned, coordinated, and executed their operation with speed and precision, while the Allies were slow to react and misjudge the situation. That, in a nutshell, is how they managed to pull off this seemingly impossible invasion.
A real masterclass in surprise and decisive action. But there's still the big question. How did Germany, with a much weaker navy, manage to control the sea and the air long enough to get their troops ashore and secure their objectives?
That's the really fascinating part, and this is where the concept of battle space dominance comes into play. It's a crucial idea in understanding how they pulled it off.
Okay, so what is battle space dominance in this context?
Imagine you're trying to control a specific area, like the sea and air around Norway. Battle space dominance means you have enough control to protect your own ships and planes and to stop the enemy from doing what they want in that area.
So, like controlling the chessboard, but in a military sense.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean you have to control everything all the time, just enough to achieve your goals. The U.S. Navy uses this concept a lot in their modern strategy.
Okay, that makes sense. But how did the Germans, with their smaller navy, even hoped to achieve this against the mighty Royal Navy?
He knew they couldn't take on the Royal Navy directly. That would have been suicide. So they had a plan.
A cunning plan, I hope.
It was pretty cunning. They decided to commit their entire surface fleet to the operation, plus a big chunk of their air force and their U-boats.
All in. A high-stakes gamble.
It was. They knew they had to neutralize the small Norwegian Navy quickly and, if possible, scare off or at least disrupt the British Navy.
Deterrence through overwhelming force, even if it's a bit of a bluff.
Exactly. And they knew that both the British and the Norwegians were expecting them to play by the rules to try and secure complete control of the sea before launching any landings.
The classic naval doctrine. Control the sea, then land your troops.
Right. But the Germans were thinking outside the box.
So how do they turn this assumption to their advantage?
They took a huge risk by using their warships to transport the first wave of troops.
Whoa, that's bold. Warships aren't exactly designed for carrying lots of soldiers.
They're not. And it stretched their fleet thin. But they had to move fast and keep the element of surprise.
Because using regular transport ships would have been too slow and obvious?
Exactly. A massive convoy would have tipped off the British for sure, so they loaded up every available warship with troops and sent them in.
A desperate but calculated gamble.
It was. Even Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy, knew it was risky. He told Hitler that it went against all the established rules of naval warfare.
But he must have seen the potential payoff.
He did. He believed that the element of surprise could make up for their lack of naval power. And it worked. This audacious move caught the British completely off guard.
And they even used some clever deception to further throw the British off balance, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They sent their 2 battlecruisers, the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, north with some destroyers.
It is a diversion.
Exactly. They deliberately engaged a British battlecruiser, the HMS Renown. The British, thinking this was a major breakout attempt, sent a huge chunk of their fleet to intercept them.
Leaving the Norwegian coast undefended.
Exactly. It was a brilliant feint. And while that was happening, the German destroyers attacking Marvik quickly took out the 2 main Norwegian coastal defense ships. They didn't even give them a chance to fight back.
Brutal efficiency.
Yeah. And then there's the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. They were absolutely crucial in this whole operation.
We've talked about air power a bit, but how did they specifically contribute to achieving sea control?
Well, they were relentless. They attacked Allied ships, bombed coastal defenses, and basically made it impossible for the British to operate freely in Norwegian waters.
So denying the enemy control of the air.
Exactly. They forced the British to withdraw their ships from southern Norway and even disrupted their attempts to supply their troops near Trondheim.
We even have examples of them directly attacking British warships, like the HMS Suffolk.
Yeah, the Suffolk was sent to bombard Sola airfield to distract the Germans from the Trondheim landings, but it got hammered by German dive bombers and had to limp back to base.
Shows you how vulnerable even big warships are to air attacks.
Totally. And the British weren't the only ones to lose a ship to air power. Their bombers actually managed to sink the German cruiser Königsberg in Christiansand Harbor.
A tit for tat, but a significant loss for the Germans nonetheless.
It was. And it highlights the changing nature of naval warfare. Even back then, it was clear that air power could be a game changer.
And the Germans definitely recognized this, didn't they? There was that famous quote from one of their Air Force commanders about air power replacing sea power.
Yeah, the acting chief of staff of Flagger Course X actually said that the Norwegian campaign proved that sea power alone wasn't enough anymore. He believed that, in the right conditions, air power could effectively control the sea, even without a big surface fleet.
A revolutionary idea at the time.
It was. It sparked a lot of debate, but it definitely showed that the rules of naval warfare were changing.
So air power was a huge factor. But what about the U-boats? They had a lot of submarines. What role did they play?
That's interesting. Their role in this operation was quite different from their usual Atlantic operation.
Oh, so.
Well, normally they focused on sinking merchant ships, disrupting supply lines.
Right, classic submarine warfare.
Exactly. But for Norway, they were tasked with supporting the surface fleet and the Luftwaffe.
So a more direct combat role.
Right. They were supposed to attack Allied warships and troop transports, screen the Norwegian coast, and even operate around Britain to disrupt their naval movements.
Sounds like a pretty ambitious plan.
It was. But despite their numbers, they weren't very effective in this campaign.
Why not? It seems like having all those submarines should have made a difference.
Well, a few things went wrong. First off, operating in the northern waters was tough. The nights were short, so they had less time to surface and recharge their batteries.
A logistical challenge.
Yeah. And the Allies were getting better at anti-submarine warfare. They had better detection methods and more aggressive patrols.
So the U-boats were facing a tougher enemy.
They were. And then there's the biggest problem. Their torpedoes were terrible.
What do you mean?
The German torpedoes at that time had a really high failure rate. Something like 66% of the torpedoes they fired didn't even explode.
66%? That's a disaster.
It was. It meant they couldn't sink ships reliably, even when they got a good shot. So, yeah, the U-boats, despite their numbers, weren't a major factor in controlling the sea during the Norwegian campaign.
A disappointing performance. So, if the U-boats weren't that effective, how else did the Germans try to control the sea?
Well, they knew they couldn't just rely on their ships and planes. They also focused on capturing key land-based infrastructure like ports and harbors.
So denying those facilities to the Allies.
Exactly. By seizing those ports quickly, they could prevent the Allies from landing troops, providing naval support, and setting up supply lines.
A land-based strategy to support their naval goals.
Exactly. And the coastal artillery forts were a big part of this. Even if they were a bit outdated, those forts could still pack a punch and make it really dangerous for enemy ships to get close.
I bet the British weren't too keen on facing those coastal guns.
They weren't. It actually factored into their decision to call off a planned bombardment of Bergen and to hesitate about landing troops directly at Trondheim.
So those old forts still had some strategic value.
They did. And the Germans were smart about using them. In Bergen, they even snuck in a transport ship disguised as a lumber carrier.
Sneaky.
Yeah, it slipped into the harbor right after the landings and laid mines, making it even harder for the Allies to attack.
Turning the tables on their opponents.
Exactly, but they did make a mistake at Narvik. They were counting on the Norwegians having some big coastal guns there to protect their ships.
What?
Turns out, those guns didn't exist. The batteries had been delivered years ago, but never installed.
Ouch. A serious intelligence failure.
It was, and it cost them dearly later on, when the British Navy came back with a vengeance and sank all their destroyers at Narvik.
So a mix of clever planning and a bit of luck, but also a reminder that intelligence failures can have disastrous consequences.
Absolutely. Now, what about the landings themselves? How did the Norwegian coastal defenses affect the German operations at those other key ports?
Yeah, we haven't talked about Trondheim, Stavanger, Kristiansand, or Oslo yet.
Okay, so Stavanger, Bergen, and Kristiansand, they didn't face much resistance on the ground. But the Norwegian shore batteries at Bergen and Kristiansand did cause some trouble.
So those guns weren't just for show.
Nope. The Königsberg, the German cruiser that got sunk later, actually took a beating from the Bergen batteries. And at Kristiansand, the Germans had to call in airstrikes to silence a particularly stubborn Norwegian battery.
Shows you how tough those coastal defenses could be.
Yeah, they weren't easy to crack. Now, Oslo was a completely different story.
Okay, what happened there?
It was a mess for the Germans.
Right.
Their first attempt to enter Oslo Fjord went horribly wrong. Their lead cruiser, the Blucher, got pummeled by Norwegian artillery at Drøbak Sound and sank.
That's a big loss.
It was, and it gets worse. The Blucher was carrying the headquarters staff of the infantry division that was supposed to take Oslo, as well as the guys who were supposed to capture the king and the government.
Oh no. Talk about a critical failure.
It was a disaster. The rest of the German ships had to retreat and spend the rest of the day trying to knock out those forts with a mix of ground attacks and airstrikes.
So a major delay and setback for the Germans.
Yeah. They were only able to enter Oslo the next day after paratroopers had captured the Fornebu airfield and basically cleared the way for them. And even then, their pocket battleship Lutzow got torpedoed by a British submarine on the way back home.
So even though they eventually took Oslo, it was a costly victory.
It was. It showed that the Norwegian defenses, even when outdated and undermanned, could still inflict serious damage.
A lesson the Germans wouldn't soon forget. And they didn't just rely on brute force either, did they? They also used some sneaky tactics to confuse the Norwegians.
Oh, yeah. They used a bunch of tricks to try and fool the Norwegian defenses. They'd pretend to be British ships, using fake names, and even signaling in English.
Talk about audacious.
It was. Like at Bergen, the German cruiser Cullen pretended to be HMS Cairo when it approached the harbor.
So, exploiting the Norwegian trust of the British.
Exactly. And it worked because the Norwegians had standing orders not to fire on British or French ships.
A case of clever deception paying off.
Well,
So they took some big risks, they used some cunning tricks, and they exploited weaknesses in the Norwegian defenses. That's how they managed to get control of those key ports, despite being outmatched at sea. But once they were ashore, they still had the problem of getting reinforcements and supplies across the Skagerrak, with the Royal Navy still lurking out there.
that was a huge challenge throughout the campaign. Even with their early successes, they needed to secure those sea lanes to bring in more troops, heavy equipment, and all the supplies they needed, especially to Oslo.
Right, keeping those supply lines open is crucial in any invasion.
Totally. They had a plan. They'd use U-boats to screen the area, deploy anti-submarine ships, and lay minefields. Plus, they'd use those captured airfields in Denmark to provide air cover.
A layered defense for their supply routes.
Exactly. But things didn't go quite as planned. The Allies had a lot of submarines operating in the Skagerrak, and they managed to sink 3 of the 15 transports heading for Norway, plus 2 German warships.
Ouch. That's a big chunk of their shipping capacity.
It was, and the losses were even worse for the ships going to Narvik, Trondheim, and Bergen. Almost all of them got sunk.
That must have put a huge strain on their logistics.
It did. The troops on the ground were running short of ammo, food, and most importantly, fuel. This actually contributed to the loss of their destroyers at Narvik.
Because they ran out of fuel waiting for resupply.
Exactly. It was a mess. They had to rely on airdrops to get supplies to some of their units.